Hey, everybody. Welcome, and thanks for being here today. Welcome to our session, Shorter, Faster, Cheaper, and Higher Quality. Our session will explore the art and science of building and evaluating quality education and training programs. What works, why, and how do learners, workers, and employers navigate the complex marketplace that's exploded as a result of the economic downturn, COVID, and so forth. And how do we know what is and is not a quality program? Over the last few days at South by Southwest EDU, we've heard a lot of discussion around skills-based hiring, matching platforms. How do we know somebody has the proficiency? We just heard Scott Pulsifer talk about that after completing. And it seems to me that the issue of quality is at the center of all of these pieces, including policy. So how do we know what works? How do we know where to invest? And these and among other topics are what we're going to explore a little bit. Quickly, I'd like to thank ECMC Group for your generous support for helping us here today. And joining me on stage are Jeremy Wheaton, President and CEO of ECMC Group, Hector Mujica, Economic Opportunity Lead, Americas for Google.org, and Christina Ishmael, Deputy Director, Office of EdTech, U.S. Department of Education. Welcome all. So I'd love to kick our conversation off by asking each of you to talk a little bit about your work and also sort of one big idea, one big piece of your work as related to understanding quality and efficacy of training and provider programs. So Jeremy, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. So ECMC Group, not yet a household name, so let me tell you a little bit about us. We're a nonprofit education organization that really focuses on creating, investing, and delivering innovative education. We've got a mission to help students succeed, and we do that in a few different ways through our philanthropic efforts at ECMC Foundation, and also through ECMC Education underneath our Altiris Career Colleges and Altiris Training Solutions brand names. We have 3 schools, one located in Georgia, one in Florida, and one in Georgia, and we focus on career and technical education in allied health and trades programs. I think that we do a lot as well on the investing and creating side through our philanthropic efforts, as well as our impact investing that we do as well. So I will say one big idea, right?
Yep.
So one big idea, and this is one that we were working on before the pandemic, and the pandemic really forced us into probably getting through this quicker than we thought we would, but we had about 1,300 students that were attending our trade schools, and we are believers that you can deliver quality career and technical education from a distance. I know that's a little counterintuitive, but we had iPads in everyone's hands. Maybe most importantly, we had an employer-informed curriculum and faculty that really believed that we could deliver quality career and technical education from a distance. So within 10 days, we had to flip and turn and send all those students home to learn their career and technical education at home. No more hands-on labs and classrooms. And we were in that mode for about 4 months before we could come back in. We racked up about 5,000 competencies that we had to check off once we got back. And really the petri dish here was we had as high a pass rates on those 5,000 competencies where those students were educated at a distance with their iPad, with Nearpod, with access to our faculty, and those pass rates were the same as if they'd been hands-on in the lab. So big idea, you can deliver quality career and technical education from a distance, and one silver lining to the pandemic is we were able to prove that out over a number of months when we probably would have piloted for years without it. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Hector, over to you.
First of all, good morning. Thanks for having me. Thanks for hosting us, JFF. My name is Hector Mujica. I lead the Economic Opportunity Portfolio for Google.org, which is Google's philanthropy. And we've been actively working in the economic opportunity space for several years. Since 2017, we've invested over $110 million into the space, really trying to create stronger, better pathways into the digital economy for historically underserved or marginalized communities. The one big idea that I want to talk about is a recent announcement that we made at google.org, which is really focused on financing. So we know, it's not a secret to any of you in this room that there is a skills gap in the U.S. There's a high demand for college degrees. There's a high demand for digital skills. We know that 2/3 of jobs are going to require digital skills over the next 10 years. And there's a big gap in terms of who has those skills, and a big discrepancy in terms of what communities have access to those skills. We know that BIPOC communities are disproportionately impacted and left out of access to pathways for those skill sets. And we know that there's additional barriers that those communities face to be able to gain those skills. And to be able to address those barriers, we need to be providing the right set of wraparound supports. So what we've been working on has been, how do we deploy? We've deployed over $50 million to support organizations like JFF to do thinking and implement and test what are some of those solutions and those wraparound supports that can help remove those barriers. At the end of the day, that ecosystem has been entirely dependent on philanthropy. Philanthropy is finite, and it's not sustainable, it's not scalable, which is why a couple of weeks ago we made an announcement. We announced a $100 million fund. We're calling it the Google Career Certificate Fund, to support employer-backed credentials, which are credentials that we've developed in-house at Google. They are not pathways into jobs exclusively at Google. They're pathways to jobs in the digital economy, any entry-level job in IT, UX design, data analyst, etc. But our hope is that through these employer-backed credentials, we can pair them up with the right wraparound supports, whether they be cash stipends, whether they be transportation credits, mentors, coaching, job placement support, and deploy through this $100 million fund what we're calling outcomes-based loans. So they're very similar to the concept of an income share agreement, which folks might be familiar with, and these are going to be outcomes-based loans that have the most learner-friendly terms in the ecosystem. And what we're really proud of with this intervention is we're going to be deploying them through social finance. Social finance is going to be bringing on board a handful of implementing partners like Merit America and Year Up, which are the ones that we're going to be initially testing this out with. And they're going to be deploying these outcomes-based loans against learners, primarily focused on wraparound supports, right? So these are going to be really thinking again about those stipends, those living stipends, those coaching supports, wraparound supports, and enabling those individuals that are tapping into the fund, tapping into these outcomes-based loans, and providing the most friendly terms in terms of how do we ensure that these learners are going to be protected? How do we ensure that these learners are not going to have to repay unless they meet a minimum income threshold in a certain time frame? That we're also holding the implementing partners accountable, right? We're putting the right incentives into place to ensure that these organizations are going to be providing the best supports possible to these learners. And what I'm really proud of and what I'm really excited about with this intervention is that we're hopeful that we'll be able to pair up some best-in-class measurement and evaluation against this fund, against the learners that are going through the fund, to really study and understand the efficacy of these type of programs, of these type of outcome-based loans, and hopefully be able to prove that either they work or they don't work. So we're really approaching this from a very humble stance, understanding that this is not a silver bullet. We don't think this is going to be the one-all, end-all, the be-all, end-all solution for workforce development, but we do think they serve a purpose for a segment of learners, and we want to validate that, and we want to prove that, and we want to make sure that we're measuring that, and we're measuring the efficacy and communicating that to the ecosystem effectively. So I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to catalyze a new way to finance workforce development for BIPOC communities.
Christina.
How do I follow up that? I don't
know, it's a lot.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Ishmael. I use pronouns she, her, the deputy director, but acting director in practice, because why not change the titles? Also, they said, dress like a Fed, and I took that very seriously. So I have to tell you, my background is in early childhood and elementary education. So this is a new kind of area for me. Certainly have been in this space for the past few years, but it's really great to be part of these conversations, and I appreciate the opportunity. In case you don't know, there is an Office of Ed Tech that exists at the U.S. Department of Education. We are a small and mighty team of 6 people, and we are in the process of trying to kind of rebuild and build back better, build up capacity in our focus areas. We are congressionally mandated. We have existed since the mid-90s, and we primarily do our work through the National Ed Tech Plan, and that is a publication that comes out on a cyclical basis every 5 or 6 years, and that will actually be my legacy to this field, is updating the National Ed Tech Plan. Sharon Liu, who is with JFF Labs, and you might see her running around, was also responsible for the higher ed supplement to the National Ed Tech Plan. So we're trying to figure out how best to incorporate higher education as well as workforce in this refresh. And so that will certainly be something that we are prioritizing within our work. But I want to say, as far as the big ideas when it comes to all of this, is obviously the pivot. I love that word, and it really does remind me of the Friends episode. But the pivot to online and this emergency remote learning, we are very careful about the language we use. We want to say this was emergency remote learning because it was not necessarily best practice. Distance education is its own field, has a deep history of well over 100 years with original correspondence courses. And there is research and things that we can pull from to learn about best practices. And so even the secretary mentioned that yesterday on the panel, and I was like, yes, he got my talking points. But I do want to really think about the big idea around multimodal, how we make sure that folks that don't necessarily have computers or tablets can access their learning and their certification programs even on their mobile phones. And so I want to think about that, as well as continuing some of these hybrid or blended learning models that we've seen have worked really well. 2 weeks ago, I was in Phoenix, Arizona, attending an event with ASU, which is my alma mater, and was hearing from President Crow, where he was saying, we're really increasing the number of blended and hybrid programs and courses that we offer. And I said, I took my English 101 course in 2001, and it was blended. I was asynchronous on a Tuesday, and I was synchronous in class with my professor on Thursdays. That was 21 years ago. They've continued to increase that, but we haven't necessarily seen that surge. And so I want to make sure that we're continuing to think of our end users, our historically underserved populations, and making sure that they can access their learning through all of the different ways. I also want to be really respectful and cognizant of culturally responsive and linguistically responsive materials. We talk about that a lot in K-12, and that continues to be a topic of conversation. I've yet to hear more of that at the higher ed or even in the workforce training kind of area. So I want to push for that as much as I can.
Thank you all. I mean, it's a lot to put on the table for us in a relatively short amount of time here today. I'd like to focus on equity, as our next sort of for each of you to talk about a little bit. So can you speak a bit about your work and also how it touches other areas like policy? You were talking about some technology, how your work is focused on creating equitable outcomes for all people, Black, Latinx, American Indian and Native communities, many others. Christina, I'm going to stick with you for a minute. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how the Office of Ed Tech is thinking about equity explicitly.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. I think we're going to take it a little bit further and think about digital equity, particularly. The reason why I bring that up is because in the bipartisan infrastructure law that was signed by the president back in November was the first time we've actually had a definition codified in law of digital equity and digital inclusion. I'm happy to give you the specific section number if you would like, but it's incredibly helpful for us to have that definition to drive all of our work. So the the draft, keyword draft, office priorities. We will hopefully be finalizing those with the secretary shortly, but we are grounding everything in digital equity and opportunity. And so we know that there are 38 million households that qualify for the Emergency Connectivity Fund run through the FCC, and only 9 million have applied and qualified. It's a stipend to be able to help afford our internet connectivity plans. So that's how we're kind of thinking about the equity in our space, because we know that access is incredibly important. We also know affordability is also, that's also important. And then the adoption of that. And so those are kind of those three areas that we're focusing on through these, a new initiative called the Digital Equity Education Roundtables, or DEAR, because we like an acronym. And so we're definitely looking at it from that access, affordability, and adoption.
Fantastic. And Jeremy, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about equity in your work.
Christina, only 6 people, so we're gonna have to pitch in and help a little
Please
bit
do.
at ECMC Group. You talked about the emergency action, and I don't want to lose sight of that. Hopefully, we can put together what we've learned underneath those actions and give a comfort level with some of those becoming more permanent, specifically the connectivity and the access, right? So we've made decent strides over the last couple of decades on access generally. I think where we've fallen short, where we've given more access, is the number of folks that we've been able to get through the process, right? So Scott, right, before this talked about some really low numbers and kind of the mid 20% completion. Some of the poorest in our communities, that's a 16% completion rate, right? So when we're talking about equity, let's continue these gains in the access. Let's try to make some of these more permanent. But then what are we going to do to actually help those that have the most stress in their lives, the least experience maybe from a family perspective, and being able to complete, to give them the tools to be able to get there. So when you think about equity, access, the opportunity to be successful, the ability to complete. So Hector, you talked about the wraparound services. So for us at ECMC Group and ECMC Education, at the foundation, we're thinking about career readiness and college success. Let's make sure that you have as much information as you can to make the right decision about your career path ahead of time. So hopefully you're heading into something that's going to help you out. But then once you get there, are your basic needs covered? And one thing we discovered through the pandemic here, a basic need now is connectivity. If you do not have the tools and the connectivity, meaning the technology, you're not going to be successful. And then once you get there, at Altiris, what we found is, you've got to have access to food, access to health, safety, housing, the wellness from a mental well-being perspective. And those are the things that we provided even from a distance to our students. And we have around 80% Pell Grant eligible, so some of those most needy students, and we're completing them at around a 70% rate. And as we sent those students home, equity to me, again, means reaching out and ensuring you have what you need to be successful. For every 2 weeks, we're surveying our faculty. Do you feel like you can be successful and your students can be successful? Students, do you feel like you have what you need to be successful? Anyone who responded no, we help them get the food or the connectivity or the well-being help. One final thing I'll just say, we also had emergency loans for folks. So thanks to the department for providing funds there, but we also made funds available from our foundation and from ECMC Group. And what we found is that the students who raised their hand and said, I need help, and we gave a small amount of money to, on average, less than $500, you would think they're most at risk, right? They said, I can't keep coming. That money allowed them to complete at a higher rate than what our general completion rate was. So 80% of the students who received emergency aid within Altiris actually completed the program. And for emergency aid that we provided through our foundation, we're just starting to get that back from a number of MSI schools. And we're finding a very similar outpacing of retention amongst those who received emergency aid relative to the to the other students within the university. So for us, equity is the access, but absolutely doing everything we can ensure that those students can complete and get to a career that's going to give them a family-sustaining wage.
And Hector, I mean, that seems to segue directly into your sort of central thesis of wraparound supports and so forth. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how that works specifically for tech pathways. Maria had talked about our purpose-built report that just came out in partnership with Comcast and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about from your all's perspective on that?
Yeah, happy to. I think equity, racial justice, that's at the core of how we approach all of our grant making and all of our philanthropy at google.org. And that's definitely the lens through which we approach all the grant making. We do so in kind of two ways, right? There's one, selecting the populations that we serve, two, selecting the type of organizations that we fund. With the type of populations that we serve, we have been pretty adamant over the past few years to be hyper-focused on non-traditional job seekers. These are individuals that lack a 4-year degree, that didn't go to community college, and there's about 71 million of them, right? To borrow from the vernacular that the folks at Opportunity at Work have come up with, that these are stars, people that are skilled through alternate routes. And for this population is disproportionately BIPOC, disproportionately Black and brown, and these are the folks that are most marginalized. They have the most impediments to opportunity, to high wage, high growth jobs, to upward mobility. So that's the type of population that we tend to be targeting through all of our grant making, through all the programs that we put out, including this fund that I just spoke about. On the flip side, on the type of organizations that we tend to engage with and target for funding, these are organizations, to your point, that are really adamant about being immersed in the community, that have a deep connection with the communities they're serving. They're either led and serving the community, so they're either Black-led, Black serving, Latin-led, Latin serving, or otherwise organizations that have, again, a deep cultural, nuanced understanding of the right tactics and the right ways to best serve those populations. And we do so because, again, they get to lean more heavily into the lived experience of the individuals they're trying to serve, and they get to, therefore, design solutions with that lived experience in mind. We've seen time and time again organizations try to prescribe different solutions at mass, and we know that the best solutions actually tend to be the ones that are not necessarily prescriptive for the whole, but more so for the individual when you design for the individual that you're trying to solve for. So that's really how we keep equity at the core of all the work that we do at .org.
That's excellent. I'm watching our timer here. Our time is going so fast. We've got about a little less than 12 minutes left. So I actually want to come to, because this ties to some discussions that are going to be coming up here. I'd like to turn us a little bit to access and technology. So blended, leveraging iPads, as well as some of those community supports. And you were talking about broadband access. I wonder if we could sort of have a discussion around how we can ensure equity in outcomes when not everybody has equal access to some of these technologies. So how does that work? And Hector, in your work, how are you all thinking about that? Jeremy, in yours. So Jeremy, I'll actually start with you, if that's okay.
Oh, great, thank you. Well, I often get that magic wand question, right, at the end of an interview. If you had hopefully I didn't steal a question.
No,
but if you have a magic wand,
what would you
what would you do? What would you wave over it? And it's really having all entities working together. So our policymakers, our community, our companies. So to your question, really about how where we could have folks, I think you have to have your employers engaged and you have to have your employers involved. So if you want access, we've got the Title IV opportunity from a department perspective, but where you have employers leaning in and saying, here's what we need from your graduates, from your completers, and they participate in building that curriculum. And then they're present as you're teaching on the way through. I literally have had an employer knock me out of the way back when we were all getting together at the schools and say, sorry, I have to get to my future employees. Of course, it's the students coming in for this HVAC program that they helped us build. We didn't lose anyone out of those first two cohorts when the employers were that present and that involved. And so it works on ground, but I really want to point out that it also works in training and it works at a distance. So the also in HVAC, but a national HVAC employer came to us with an issue of training. They were bringing in, all of their techs, taking them out of the field, bringing them in to train them, and it was costing a lot of money. The completion rate wasn't quite where they wanted, and they can we do this from a distance? So we're able to have those technicians stay in field, stay with their family. This was prior to the pandemic, so then actually during the pandemic receive the training as well, and also be side by side with more veteran technicians and be able to have mentorship, apprenticeship from them. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we've trained 155 technicians with this group, and we were able to see a completion rate that's 95%. It's about probably 30% better than they were seeing when they were taking them out of field, bringing them in, training them quickly for a week on 3-ring binders and paper, and now it's all online and able to be done at home or in the truck or wherever they have as a gap, and to be able to do it for about 40% of the cost as well. So cheaper, faster in a way because you're able to multitask, but higher quality too, because at the end of the day, you're getting a higher success rate in completion. So, that's really our quest, is to find more employers that want to work with us along those lines, for us to put our learnings, experience, technology to work to help them attract and train and retain a greater number of employees and shrink the skills gap that Hector spoke to earlier.
Absolutely, and we won't have enough time to get into sort of the brain science behind learning outcomes with some of these platforms, but it's very compelling. We might get into some of that later a little bit. But Christine, I wonder if you could talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, so we think about the broadband access, of course, which is quite significant. But I'm just going to say, as the acting director of the Office of Ed Tech, technology is a tool. It is like a pencil. In fact, a dear friend of mine and former colleague from the Nebraska Department of Education once said, "Do we take students to a pencil lab? Like, why would we take them to a computer lab? We want technology to be ubiquitous, but we have to make sure that it has, again, back to the availability, the affordability, and the adoption of that." We also work with folks that don't have any access. I've worked with some school districts, some rural school districts in Oregon, who only have satellite as an option, and they have to go out and scoop the snow off for their students to be able to access the broadband. And the same can be said in higher education or in homes. And so we certainly have to make sure that there is the infrastructure, which is what that $65 billion investment is through the bipartisan infrastructure law. But making things available offline is also really important. I love a good paper book still. Like, I read physical books. So do our learners, whether they're in schools or whether they're in workforce programs. Like, it all matters. As far as the quality is concerned, I think it's also important for us to use the bully pulpit of the U.S. Department of Education to have these conversations and to lead these conversations. We're not going to tell you what quality looks like. We can be part of these events to say quality matters. There are other organizations that will help take you, through that quality process. But we can have those conversations and say, this is an important piece of all of these types of programs. And so it's just a good blend of all of these things, and I'm very, very fortunate to be in this position.
Fantastic. And Hector, for you, similar question. With the explosion of learning models, interest in tech pathways, huge opportunity for individuals. How do we ensure equal access to those pathways when not everybody has equal access to broadband and other tech?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think we think a lot at .org about incentive alignment, and how do we ensure that incentives are going to be aligned throughout, from the lens of the learner, the lens of the workforce development provider, the lens of the employer, and how do we make sure that all parties involved have some skin in the game, right? How do we make sure that everybody involved is going to have some equitable skin in it, so that they can remain committed to upskill, reskill, to be employed, to be leveraging the right set of skilling, formatting, and whatnot, right? And when we thought about that, for example, I'll give an example. When we thought about that in the design of the fund, we ensured that all of our implementing partners, like the Europes and Merit Americas of the world, are going to have some skin in the game financially for the training and the capacity building of all the individuals that they're ultimately reaching through the program. And that really incentivizes them at the end of the day to have a successful outcome, to have a learner that is equipped with the right tools, with the right knowledge, with the right job readiness skills, and ultimately that is placed in a high growth, high paying job with a good upward mobility trajectory. So to us, again, that incentive alignment point has been something that is core to the design. The other piece that I think is also really important is the measurement, right? So what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. We have to be really intentional about putting rigorous measurement and evaluation behind all the programs that we do, whether they be programs to roll out broadband, whether they be programs to upskill, reskill individuals. I think it's just imperative that we put a lot of intentionality behind understanding what's working, what's not working, so we can be most effective and most efficient in those programs.
Fantastic. And we've got just a few minutes left, so perhaps we'll go with sort of final thoughts from the conversation around quality and efficacy, all the things that we've experienced here at EDU. Christina, Hector, and then Jeremy, I'll give you the last word.
Oh, that's a lot of pressure. Again, when we think about the quality, we certainly want to be a part of these conversations. We know that it does not have to be the traditional way that we all experienced either our K-12 or even our higher education experiences. So it's providing the multimodal access for learners, whether they are young children or are adults entering the workforce. What are they going to experience when they are out there doing their jobs in the future? So again, multimodal, and I'll go back to the culturally responsive and linguistically responsive for our historically underserved communities. It's really important in all the things that we're doing.
Excellent. Hector?
I think what I'll mention is there are no silver bullets. I think if there was a silver bullet, we would have figured it out by now. So there are no silver bullets. I think we have to acknowledge that, and we have to approach the work accordingly, and as a result, test a lot of different solutions, innovate constantly, and keep equity, justice, and the most marginalized at the core of what we are testing and how we're approaching the work.
Excellent. Wow, you guys were tight. That was great. So last word, you talk about pressure, Christina. Last word, maybe I'll just do a little shameless plug, Steve. We're talking about, what we're trying to achieve on the equity front, the access, the completion front. As I mentioned earlier, we've got ECMC Foundation. We're doing over $40 million of grant making annually, again, on career readiness and college success. Our ECMC Education Impact Fund. We've got a $250 million fund that we're putting towards innovative solutions to advance exactly what we're talking about here, helping those that are most underserved found a career pathway that's best for them. So if you've got great ideas, it's hard. You've got this money and you're trying to put it to work, and just finding people who want to utilize it. So please look us up at ECMC Group if you've got great innovative thoughts and ideas on the education front that you think is grant worthy or impact fund worthy, or if you're a policymaker, we love to partner and augment those 6 folks that you have to be able to get more folks access and on a pathway to really having great family success.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much. It's a hugely important topic, and I appreciate everyone's thoughts today. Enjoy the rest of the panels.
Thank you all.